In the beginning, there was Atari, and that didn't do so well. And then came a couple of other companies, and they've done better, like Nintendo.
Yes.
But Sony really knocked us on our butts with the launch of the PlayStation 1 back in 1995 in North America. It came out in 1994. What do you remember about the PlayStation 1?
That was the first widely released CD-ROM days. I mean, if you remember the origin story of the PlayStation,
the third, I
was
think.
originally a deal between Nintendo and
Yes.
Sony that went bad, and Sony said, well, screw you, Nintendo. We're going to make our own thing. Nintendo would rue the day
Yeah.
that they turned their back on Sony. And you know what? I loved cartridges. I loved the instantaneousness of it. And I resented the CD-ROM. I hated those two words, now loading. I'd never seen them before until the PlayStation 1 came along. But you could not argue with Resident Evil.
Yeah.
You could not argue with Gran Turismo. You could not argue with your beloved Solid Snake himself, Metal Gear Solid, Hideo Kojima's best game ever.
Yeah, I think what really started to happen with the PlayStation 1, it wasn't so much that we took this huge leap in art, but what we got was production. We got full motion video and things like Warhawk. We got crazy 3D animation, like in Jumping Flash, where the robots would fall thousands of meters in the air.
Crash Bandicoot.
Crash Bandicoot.
But you know, at the other end of the spectrum, too, there was a great maturing that was going on, too. Games were getting more sophisticated. We were getting
more money.
We were getting a lot more full motion video. Those intro cutscenes were just beautiful. Siphon Filter was a tipping point for me as well. As hard as I tried to resist the charms and the siren call of the PlayStation 1, I eventually fell for and hard.
Yeah, and Final Fantasy VII, I think, really represented a high watermark on the PlayStation 1 as well. And it wasn't so much that it looked like a prettier game than the sprite-based Final Fantasy games did on Super Nintendo, but we had this incredible orchestral music, and it was on multiple discs.
The soundtracks got
Amazing.
more interesting, too, as well. And
Yes.
would get more interesting once we got to the PlayStation 2.
With the PlayStation 2, everything got kicked up a notch, and it was a very noticeable improvement. I remember the first time playing SSX, I had a projector in my house
one
at
of
the
the
time.
launch titles.
And it was the best launch title. It actually gave me motion sickness.
Yeah. What would your mother think?
The PlayStation 2 took a while to get going, but man, did it ever.
Boy, did it ever.
It launched some really great games.
There were all of these reports that developers were having a hard time programming for this machine. It was a very obtuse machine to work with, but once they figured it out, once the developers got the hang of it, we saw something we'd never seen before in the form of Grand Theft Auto 3.
Yeah, that was an incredible exclusive for these guys to get. And then we also saw that games like Prince of Persia, Sands of Time, and Beyond Good and Evil, the Need for Speed,
This was a machine that just
Hot Pursuit 2. Remember that game on
I love
PlayStation
that
2?
game. Hot Pursuit 2 was the best.
There was great racing. Gran Turismo made a reappearance. Sports were fantastic. Madden looked really incredible.
Devil May Cry came along and changed my world.
Metal Gear Solid 2 and my favorite Metal Gear game so far, Metal Gear Solid 3, both were PlayStation 2 exclusives.
Still stands tall as the best-selling console of all time.
Right.
This thing would not quit. You couldn't kill it. You know, the little skinny one that they made? I love that thing. You will have to pry that from my cold, dead hands.
It will also proved itself as a really competent DVD player. It kind of replaced that functionality in people's homes.
First DVD player I ever owned, and it was totally difficult to work with the on-screen controls. I didn't have the remote control, but somehow I got to watch movies on discs. I got to play awesome games on discs. Sony was killing it, and then they invented the PlayStation 3 in the mid-2000s. And
boy, did they have some beautiful pre-rendered videos at the
by the disaster that was the beginning of this console's life cycle.
But it took a while for developers, even in the first-party stable that Sony has, to really grapple with the nuts and bolts of the machine to deliver stuff that was better than Xbox.
A couple of launch titles that come to mind for me: Resistance, Fall of Man. I loved it, played it to death. Terrific work from our good friends at Insomniac.
Which they kind of stretched out a little too long, that franchise.
I don't know what happened to it.
Would you look at that mess?
And then the PlayStation 3 would go on to deliver Uncharted, Uncharted 2, and of course, more recently, The Last of Us, which just blew our heads clean off this year.
One of my favorite things about PlayStation is their investment in development. You know, they have not shied away from taking risks.
Well, look what they've done with indies.
Yeah, with indies like Flower and Journey, but also with David Cage games, which probably wouldn't have been paid for anywhere else. Even The Last of Us, which is a massive success, is a risk. It would have been a gamble at any other studio, but here's Sony saying, we believe in you, Naughty Dog. Make us something
Right, it's not
really
a natural
cool.
blockbuster.
Yeah.
And they have supported a lot of artists, a lot of independent visions out there.
Yeah, and another huge success, I think, for PlayStation 3 was the purchase of Sucker Punch and their investment in the Infamous brand. I loved Infamous 1 and 2.
Me too.
and obviously lots of great third-party support from different developers out there. Red Dead ran wonderfully. Batman runs wonderfully.
Still seems like it's a machine that has its trouble finding its footing at times. I mean, we're looking at developers still struggling with the hardware for some reason, but its days are numbered.
Yeah, well,
it's almost
I think
done.
in the last few years, it's really picked up steam.
gotten better.
You know, it really has become a much more accessible
it's
machine.
caught up with the 360.
Yeah, and people are ready to have that Blu-ray fidelity in their home a little bit more, right? This is their Blu-ray option if they want that in their house. It's
You're
also
into it. I'm into
the
it.
game console that accesses Netflix the most, and Netflix is a free thing. That PlayStation Plus division that they created has turned into a powerhouse for Sony.
I feel like they made a little bit of a mistake with the PlayStation 3 version of the DualShock with the mushy shoulder trigger buttons on there. It wasn't ever quite as good as the DualShock 2
Right.
on the PlayStation 2. They perfected it there, but I think they've re-perfected it again
DualShock 4.
with the PlayStation 4 DualShock. And you know what? We're going to have lots and lots of PlayStation 4 coverage in the coming weeks and months, and hopefully years, my friend. I want this thing to reign supreme and stand strong and show us what it can do. And no matter how you feel about the PlayStation 3, no matter how you feel about Sony, you cannot ignore them. They are here to stay. They are a player.